The night everything truly began was not loud, not violent, not dramatic in the way movies pretend revenge always starts. It began quietly with a bank notification glowing on a phone screen at 2:47 in the morning. The kind of moment that does not feel important until it destroys entire families. Because one unexpected transfer of $12 million moved without warning, without explanation, without consent, and in that moment a man who believed money made him untouchable unknowingly signed the first page of his own downfall. So before this story drags you deep into greed, loyalty, blood, and patience, let me ask you something real. Where are you watching this video from right now? And what time is it where you are? Because somewhere in the world someone else is learning the same lesson tonight, that power built on betrayal never survives silence. Daniel Carter had built his name on clean suits, cold smiles, and a reputation for turning struggling companies into gold. Wall Street called him disciplined, investors called him brilliant, and his family called him dependable. But none of them knew that the Carter fortune was not built on intelligence alone. It was built on control, fear, and one rule: Daniel never broke in business or at home. Never let anyone see the full picture. Not even your wife, not even your children, not even your own blood. And that rule had kept him safe for 25 years. Until the night his eldest son Michael accidentally saw a document that was never meant to exist. Michael Carter was not reckless, not weak, not rebellious. He was precise, calm, and observant in a way that scared people who liked to hide behind noise. He worked as a financial analyst in his father company Carter Holdings, not because he needed the job but because Daniel wanted his legacy protected by someone with the Carter name. But what Daniel failed to understand was that Michael did not inherit his hunger for domination. He inherited patience, the dangerous kind. The kind that waits instead of reacting, that listens instead of shouting, that collects instead of accusing. And on that night Michael was not snooping, not spying. He was covering for an assistant who had left a folder open on the shared internal drive. A folder labeled as inactive accounts, harmless, boring, invisible, except when Michael opened it and noticed transfers looping through shell companies in Nevada, Delaware, and the Cayman Islands, all leading back to one private trust under a name he did not recognize, until he scrolled down and saw the beneficiary's signature, Eleanor Carter, his grandmother, a woman who had been dead for 8 years. Confusion came first, then disbelief. Then a slow, heavy realization that something was wrong in a way that could not be explained by accounting errors. Michael did not confront anyone. He did not call lawyers. He did not ask questions. He closed the folder and went home, because instinct told him that truth this clean was never accidental, and people like his father never made mistakes without purpose. The Carter house that night was quiet, too quiet for a home that large. Marble floors, glass walls, expensive art that meant nothing, and a silence that pressed against the chest. Daniel was in his study, drinking whiskey, reviewing market numbers like he always did, and Laura Carter, Michael's mother, was asleep upstairs, unaware that the man she trusted with her life had been rewriting her reality for decades. Michael stood in the hallway watching his father through the glass door, seeing not a hero, not a protector, but a man who had turned family into an asset class. And for the first time Michael wondered whether his grandmother had really died of natural causes, or if she had simply become inconvenient. Over the next 3 weeks Michael did what he had always done best. He observed. He mapped behavior, patterns, timing, money movement. He noticed that every major transfer happened when Daniel traveled alone, that certain board members received bonuses tied to silence agreements, that the trust under his grandmother's name paid for things that had nothing to do with inheritance and everything to do with leverage, hush payments, settlements, political donations disguised as philanthropy. And then came the final confirmation, a private document stored offline, scanned once, and hidden deep. A legal amendment signed 10 years earlier that quietly removed Laura Carter and both children from any controlling stake if Daniel were declared mentally competent at the time of death. Meaning the empire would not go to family but to the trust controlled by Daniel alone. Betrayal does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers, and that whisper hit Michael harder than anger ever could. Because this was not a mistake. This was a plan to erase blood in favor of obedience, and suddenly every memory shifted shape. Every family dinner, every lecture about loyalty, every lesson about sacrifice, all of it was conditioning. Michael considered confronting his father. He imagined the shouting, the denial, the gaslighting, the threats, and he dismissed it immediately, because confrontation gives power back to the liar, and Michael was done feeding Daniel's illusions. Instead, he visited the one person Daniel underestimated completely, his younger sister Claire. Claire Carter was seen by the family as emotional, impulsive, too artistic for business. But Michael knew the truth. Claire saw patterns people missed, emotional truths, human weaknesses. She had left the company years earlier after clashing with Daniel over ethics, and that made her invisible to him now, which made her perfect. Michael did not tell her everything, not yet. He showed her pieces, financial fragments, timelines, documents without context, and watched her reaction carefully. When she went quiet instead of shocked, when her hands trembled, not with fear but with understanding, Michael knew he was not alone. Together they began building something dangerous, not revenge driven by rage, but exposure driven by inevitability. They knew Daniel thrived on control, so they would remove control one invisible thread at a time, starting with trust, then money, then reputation, then family, because Daniel's greatest weakness was not greed, it was arrogance, the belief that blood would never turn against him. Meanwhile, Laura Carter sensed something shifting in the house. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Michael became distant but gentle. Claire started visiting more often, and Daniel became sharper, colder, watching everyone like assets under audit. Laura had loved Daniel since college. She had sacrificed her career, her independence, her sense of self to support his rise, believing in the myth that families grow stronger around powerful men, but myths crack under pressure. And when Laura accidentally overheard a phone call in Daniel's study late one night, a call discussing contingency plans in case of spouse interference, something inside her broke quietly, the way glass breaks underwater, no sound but irreversible. Laura did not cry, she did not confront him, she went to sleep beside a man she no longer recognized. And in the morning she did something that would change everything. She asked Michael a simple question. One he had been waiting to hear for years. Are you sure your father is telling us everything? And in that moment the Carter family stopped being a unit and became a battlefield. Not of screaming or violence, but of patience, intelligence, and time. Because the most devastating revenge does not destroy a man overnight. It lets him wake up every day believing he is winning. Until the day he realizes the boardroom is empty, the accounts are frozen, the family is gone, and the empire he built on dollars and deception no longer belongs to him. By the time Daniel Carter sensed that something inside his world had shifted, the shift was already too deep to reverse. Because the most dangerous movements never announce themselves, they disguise as routine. And that was exactly what Michael and Claire understood as they quietly expanded their strategy beyond suspicion and into inevitability. Starting with the board, the same men who once laughed loudly at Daniel's jokes and praised his leadership were the same men who feared instability more than loyalty. And Michael knew this because he had spent years listening instead of talking, collecting weaknesses instead of favors. So he began subtly introducing alternative narratives during private conversations, never accusing Daniel directly, never implying wrongdoing, just asking careful questions about succession, continuity, and risk exposure. Questions that planted doubt without leaving fingerprints, and doubt spreads faster in boardrooms than truth ever does. Meanwhile, Claire worked from the outside, using her distance from the company as credibility rather than weakness, reconnecting with journalists, nonprofit directors, and cultural investors Daniel had once dismissed as unimportant, people who knew how reputations were shaped quietly. And she did not talk about betrayal or crime. She talked about ethics, transparency, generational responsibility, framing the Carter Empire as a case study waiting to happen, which made certain people start paying attention without knowing why. Laura Carter watched all of this unfold with a growing sense of clarity, not anger, not panic, but clarity, the kind that arrives when illusions die. She began reviewing old documents, family agreements, personal correspondence, patterns of isolation Daniel had enforced over the years, slowly realizing how methodically her life had been narrowed to serve his control. And instead of collapsing under that realization, she found strength in it. Because understanding manipulation gives power back to the manipulated. And Laura was done being managed like an asset. The first visible crack came during an investor summit in Chicago, a high-profile event meant to reassure stakeholders about Carter Holdings' long-term stability. Daniel delivered his usual confident speech, polished, commanding, convincing. But for the first time the applause felt delayed, uneven, and Michael noticed board members exchanging glances, small movements that meant everything. And later that evening during private meetings, two investors asked unexpected questions about the trust structure, questions Daniel answered smoothly but defensively, not realizing those questions had been carefully seeded weeks earlier through conversations Michael never attended officially. After the summit, Daniel confronted Michael casually, testing him, probing for disloyalty disguised as concern, and Michael responded exactly as planned, with respect, calm, and alignment, never denying or confessing anything, which frustrated Daniel more than open defiance ever could, because it gave him nothing to fight, nothing to punish. At home the atmosphere thickened, meals became shorter, conversations surface level. Laura stopped asking questions and started observing, noting Daniel's routines, his calls, his emotional tells, and she noticed something crucial: fear. Not obvious fear, but irritation when things did not move exactly as he expected, impatience when control slipped even slightly, and that told her everything she needed to know. Power does not fear challenge, it fears exposure. Michael and Claire reached the next phase quietly, shifting money without moving money. restructuring internal flows so that when Daniel believed funds were circulating freely, they were in fact being rerouted through compliance reviews and audit triggers that would activate under regulatory pressure. Pressure that Claire had already begun attracting through ethics panels and policy discussions that indirectly referenced Carter Holdings practices. Nothing illegal yet, just enough smoke to make regulators curious. Daniel responded the only way he knew how, by tightening control, isolating departments, demanding loyalty statements, and rewarding silence with bonuses, not realizing that every aggressive move confirmed the narrative forming around him, that he was not a visionary leader protecting his empire, but a man afraid of losing grip on it. Laura made her move quietly one morning. When Daniel left for New York, she met with a private attorney recommended by Claire, someone known for discretion and patience. And she did not ask for divorce. She asked for information, for clarity about her rights, her exposure, her leverage. And when she learned that Daniel's amendment had effectively removed her from control without her knowledge, something hardened inside her, not hatred, resolve, because betrayal cuts deepest when it is disguised as protection. Weeks later, the story reached its first irreversible turn when a junior compliance officer flagged inconsistencies in dormant accounts tied to the Eleanor Carter Trust. Inconsistencies Michael had carefully structured to appear organic, and as protocol required, the issue was escalated internally before regulators were notified, giving Daniel one chance to contain it, and contain it he tried, calling emergency meetings, pressuring legal teams, rewriting narratives, but the more he pushed, the more resistance he encountered, not rebellion. Just procedural obstacles, delays, documentation requirements, the kind that choke momentum without raising suspicion. Daniel started sleeping less, drinking more, snapping at staff, and for the first time Laura saw him small, not physically, but psychologically, a man shrinking inside a system he once dominated, and she realized something painful and liberating. She had never known the real Daniel, only the version that existed when control was unquestioned. The media attention remained subtle, articles about corporate transparency trends, think pieces on family-owned empires and succession ethics. Nothing with Daniel's name yet, but enough that when his appeared in the same paragraph as the concept of legacy risk, investors noticed, and perception began shifting before facts ever surfaced. Michael stayed silent publicly, attending meetings, executing tasks, playing the role expected of him, because visibility would have ruined everything. Patience was the weapon now. And every day Daniel believed nothing had happened was another day closer to collapse. The night Daniel finally confronted Laura directly was not explosive. It was cold, calculated. He accused her of turning the children against him, of undermining stability, of emotional manipulation, and Laura listened calmly, then asked him one question he had never prepared for. Why did you erase us from your future without telling us? And for a fraction of a second, Daniel's mask slipped, just enough, and Laura saw confirmation. Not guilt, not regret, calculation. And she understood that the man she married had never seen family as family, only as structure. From that moment, Laura stopped protecting him emotionally, and emotional protection had been the last shield he had left. As regulatory inquiries quietly expanded, board members began distancing themselves, scheduling fewer meetings, delegating communication through legal teams, and Daniel found himself alone in rooms he once controlled effortlessly, wondering how authority evaporated without a single public accusation. Michael knew the end was approaching but did not rush it, because rushed revenge creates martyrs, and martyrs inspire sympathy. And Daniel Carter deserved neither. He deserved to face the consequences of his own design, step by step, document by document, until the truth stood on its own, without accusation. And when that day came, no amount of money would be able to buy back trust, family, or silence. The investigation did not arrive like a storm, it arrived like winter, slow, quiet, unavoidable. And Daniel Carter felt it first, not through headlines or lawsuits but through absence, phone calls not returned, meetings postponed without explanation, allies suddenly cautious with their words, because power does not vanish loudly, it drains away through silence, and Daniel had built his empire on the assumption that silence always belonged to him. Regulators requested documents framed as routine compliance checks, nothing alarming on paper, yet the volume and specificity told a different story. Requests that suggested someone inside understood the structure deeply, and Daniel suspected Michael immediately. Not because of proof but because betrayal always feels closest, and yet suspicion alone could not save him, because every attempt to tighten control only accelerated the collapse. Departments began communicating exclusively through counsel, decisions slowed, and the machine that once moved at Daniel's command now demanded justification for every motion. Michael watched this from within with a discipline that bordered on cruelty, attending meetings where his father struggled to maintain authority, speaking only when necessary, offering solutions that complied with procedure rather than ego. Because nothing terrifies a control-driven man more than rules he cannot bend, and Michael knew the system was now doing the work for him. Claire escalated her efforts externally, not by leaking information but by shaping context, contributing to panels on ethical governance, advising cultural foundations about transparency in legacy wealth, speaking carefully about the dangers of dynastic control without accountability, and journalists listened, not because she accused, but because she framed a story the public was already hungry to hear: the slow decay of untouchable elites. Laura Carter made her presence felt in a different way. She stopped attending public events with Daniel, citing health and privacy, a subtle but devastating signal in social and financial circles where appearances function as endorsements, and people noticed. Whispers began, not of scandal but of instability, and instability is poison to investors. Daniel attempted announcing a restructuring plan that would consolidate authority under his leadership while promoting transparency. But the announcement backfired because it confirmed fears of overcentralization, and board members privately questioned whether Daniel himself had become a liability, a thought that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The first formal notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, a request for clarification regarding the Eleanor Carter Trust, its continued operation posthumously, and its role in intercompany transfers. Daniel read it twice, then a third time, understanding fully that this was no longer internal, that containment had failed, and for the first time in decades he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear of loss, but fear of exposure, because exposure reveals not just wrongdoing but intention, and intention is where reputations truly die. He summoned Michael that evening under the pretense of strategy, testing him again, pushing harder, accusing without accusing, and Michael responded with calm factuality, outlining regulatory expectations, advising cooperation, subtly positioning himself as stability rather than threat. And Daniel hated him for it, because he saw in his son the leader he had never intended to create, one who did not need dominance to command respect. The inquiry widened, auditors requested interviews, board members hired independent counsel, and suddenly Daniel was the only one defending the structure that had once made them all rich. Because when money feels threatened, people choose survival over loyalty every time. Laura filed for legal separation quietly, not as revenge but as protection, a move that further isolated Daniel socially and legally. And when he confronted her with rage disguised as wounded pride, she did not argue, she did not explain, she simply told him that love did not survive deception. And that sentence landed harder than any accusation could have, because it reframed their entire marriage as a transaction he had mismanaged. Michael and Claire reached the final internal phase, triggering audit mechanisms tied to risk thresholds Daniel himself had approved years earlier, believing they would never be used against him. And as those mechanisms activated, funds froze pending review, transactions stalled, and the cash flow that powered Carter Holdings began to choke, not from lack of money but from lack of trust. The media shifted tone subtly. Articles began naming Carter Holdings directly, not as scandal but as subject. Analysts questioned governance. Commentators discussed legacy risk, and once a name enters the conversation, perception hardens faster than facts can refute it. Daniel attempted to rally the board one last time, delivering an impassioned speech about loyalty, vision, and betrayal, but it fell flat, because loyalty demanded blindly is not loyalty, it is fear. And fear no longer worked when alternatives existed. Michael watched his father speak and felt something unexpected, not triumph, not satisfaction, but sadness, because he realized that Daniel Carter had been building against an imagined enemy his entire life, and in doing so had created the very conditions for his downfall, treating everyone as a threat until one day they became one. Regulators issued preliminary findings, not conclusions, but concerns, enough to justify deeper inquiry, enough to scare investors, and Carter Holdings' stock dipped sharply, triggering clauses that allowed board intervention, and just like that Daniel lost unilateral control, not through dramatic removal but through process, the slow bureaucratic erosion of authority. Alone in his office late one night, Daniel reviewed old photographs, awards, articles praising his genius, trying to reconcile the image of the man he believed himself to be with the reality forming around him, and for the first time he questioned whether power without trust was ever power at all. Michael and Claire met privately, not to celebrate but to plan the final steps, because they knew collapse was not the goal, accountability was, and accountability required precision, timing, and restraint. And as they looked at the data, the timelines, the inevitable outcomes, Michael understood that the revenge was no longer personal. It had outgrown family, it had become structural, and that was the most irreversible form of consequence. Because structures do not forgive, they do not negotiate. They simply execute the logic embedded within them, and Daniel Carter had written that logic himself years ago, never imagining it would one day be used against him. By the time the board formally invoked oversight authority, Daniel Carter was no longer fighting enemies, he was fighting time, and time had turned against him with a patience that mirrored his own methods. because every system he had built to protect control was now executing exactly as designed, just not in his favor. Emergency committees were formed, independent advisors installed, and Daniel's role shifted subtly from commander to subject, still present, still speaking, but no longer deciding. And that psychological demotion cut deeper than any legal notice could have, because men like Daniel do not fear punishment, they fear irrelevance. The auditor's findings began stacking into patterns, not crimes dramatic enough for headlines yet, but governance failures, conflicts of interest, legacy manipulation, the kind of slow poison that destroys reputations in elite circles where perception is currency. And investors began exiting quietly, not panicking, just repositioning, draining liquidity without noise. And Carter Holdings felt it immediately. Projects delayed, acquisitions paused, confidence evaporating like steam. Michael stepped forward publicly for the first time, not as accuser, but as stabilizer, giving measured interviews about transparency and long-term responsibility, never naming his father directly. And that contrast reshaped the narrative overnight. Daniel as the past, Michael as the future. And nothing terrifies a powerful man more than watching his replacement earn trust without demanding it. Claire pushed the final contextual shift, advising a documentary team on legacy wealth ethics, careful never to mention Carter Holdings explicitly. Yet the parallels were obvious enough that viewers connected the dots themselves. And once the public imagines a story, denial only feeds it. Laura finalized the separation legally, not seeking financial gain but autonomy, a detail that stunned Daniel's remaining allies more than greed ever could, because it reframed her not as opportunist but as survivor, and sympathy began to lean away from Daniel entirely. Under mounting pressure, regulators issued a formal notice of intent, outlining potential violations tied to trust misuse and succession manipulation, and although no verdict was declared, the damage was irreversible. Banks tightened terms, partners renegotiated, and the empire Daniel had spent decades constructing began folding inward under its own weight. Daniel attempted one last private negotiation, calling Michael into his office late at night, the same office where he had once lectured him about loyalty and legacy, and he offered a compromise disguised as reconciliation: control shared, truth buried, damage contained. But Michael declined calmly, explaining that the moment for containment had passed, that the systems were already in motion, and that the only choice left was how Daniel would be remembered: a man who accepted accountability, or a man dragged into it. That refusal shattered something in Daniel, because for the first time, someone he could not intimidate had said no, not emotionally, not angrily, but factually, and power has no defense against facts. The board voted days later to remove Daniel from executive authority pending investigation. A procedural move, clean, unemotional, devastating, and as he cleared his office under legal supervision, carrying boxes of personal items past people who avoided eye contact, Daniel understood the full weight of isolation, not because he had been betrayed, but because he had never truly allied with anyone to begin with. Michael watched from a distance, refusing to be present, because victory achieved through humiliation breeds bitterness, and Michael wanted resolution, not spectacle. The final report was released months later, dense, technical, unglamorous, outlining years of manipulation, ethical breaches, and deliberate obfuscation. And although criminal charges were limited, civil penalties were severe, trusts dissolved, assets restructured, governance rewritten, and Carter Holdings emerged smaller, humbler, but intact. No longer an empire but a company, no longer ruled by fear but by oversight. Daniel faded from public view, his name no longer spoken with admiration or outrage, just context, a case study, a cautionary tale taught in business schools without emotion, and that anonymity was his true punishment, because men who chase power crave recognition above all else. Michael assumed leadership not triumphantly, but carefully, restructuring from within, restoring trust slowly, publicly acknowledging failures without theatrics. And the market responded not with excitement but with relief, because stability is more valuable than brilliance when trust has been broken. Claire returned to her work quietly, her role complete, never claiming credit, because she had never wanted revenge, only truth. Laura moved away, rebuilding a life free from control, not wealthy by excess but rich in autonomy, something money had never given her before. Years later, Michael would reflect on the experience, not as vengeance but as consequence, understanding that the most effective revenge is not destruction, but exposure, not anger but patience, not confrontation but structure. Because when people build systems to dominate others, they forget that systems do not care who stands inside them, they only execute the logic they are given. And Daniel Carter had written that logic himself, line by line, dollar by dollar, believing it would protect him forever, never imagining it would one day quietly, methodically, and completely undo him. Years later, when the noise had fully settled, and the story of Carter Holdings had faded into footnotes and case studies, The true aftermath revealed itself not through headlines but through quiet human consequences that no balance sheet could ever record. Because while companies recover and markets adjust, families carry echoes far longer, and Michael Carter understood this more deeply than anyone as he sat alone one evening in the same house where everything had begun, now stripped of grandeur, the art sold, the rooms echoing, a place that once symbolized dominance now reduced to memory, and he realized that revenge had never been the destination. Accountability had been, because destruction is easy but rebuilding requires restraint. Daniel Carter lived out his remaining years in a smaller city, under a quieter name, consulting privately for firms that valued experience but kept him far from control. And although he never publicly admitted guilt, those who met him noticed a change. A man less certain, less commanding, haunted not by punishment but by irrelevance. Because power once lost cannot be argued back into existence. And that realization hollowed him more than any verdict ever could. Laura Carter thrived in a way no one expected, not by chasing wealth or recognition but by rediscovering identity. Volunteering with women, navigating financial dependence, speaking privately about autonomy and self-trust. Never telling her story directly, yet empowering others through presence alone. Proof that survival is its own quiet rebellion. Claire Carter continued shaping narratives from the edges, advising institutions, mentoring creators, teaching that influence does not require authority, and she often smiled at the irony that the sister once dismissed as impractical had been essential to dismantling the most rigid structure of all. Michael led differently, refusing to rule through fear, designing governance that protected against consolidation, inviting oversight rather than resisting it, because he understood now that the absence of control was not weakness, it was resilience. And under that leadership, Carter Holdings stabilized into something smaller but stronger, a company that no longer pretended to be immortal. Occasionally, journalists requested interviews about the past, and Michael declined most of them, because stories framed as revenge missed the deeper truth that the most devastating consequences come not from rage but from patience, not from confrontation but from clarity, and he did not want his family reduced to a spectacle. Sometimes late at night, Michael wondered whether things could have ended differently, whether a conversation years earlier could have changed everything, but he always reached the same conclusion. Control, built on secrecy, inevitably collapses under truth, and timing only determines how much collateral damage it causes. The Carter story became a warning told quietly in boardrooms and classrooms, about legacy without ethics, about families treated as extensions of power rather than people, about how systems designed to dominate eventually turn inward, and those who listened carefully learned that silence is not always submission. Sometimes it is preparation. If this story pulled you in, if it made you reflect on power, family, money, and patience, then pause for a moment and show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and dropping a comment with your thoughts. Because stories like this live longer when conversations continue, and your engagement helps bring more narratives that challenge illusion, expose quiet truths, and remind us that no empire built on deception ever truly lasts.